Madison's finishing up.
All right, welcome to the Rice Business Partners Faculty Roundtable. I am Sharon Beamer. I'm a current board member of Rice Business Partners, been involved about 5 years, and our mission is to inform, connect, and inspire. And so you can see on the screen, we open doors to partnerships, we provide lifelong learning, which is exactly why you guys are all here today, and we energize growth. I'd like to recognize a few of the other board members that are here today. So if you would stand up, please. The current board members. And if there's any alumni board members, please stand up. Any alumni board members? No. Oh, we have one. Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you very much for your volunteering and your commitment to the university. And if you're interested, if you're not a current member today and you're interested, please follow up with one of those board members or myself. We'd love to speak more about it. We want to share our sponsorships, which are extremely powerful for the university. We have sponsorships that range back as far as 20 years, 15 years, oops, I skipped right one through one, 10 years, 5 years. Incredible meaning to us. These companies are powerful companies here in Houston. And in addition, they're always on campus interviewing, and we very much appreciate that. And I'm excited today to have with us a gentleman that is representing Phillips Kaiser. And George Phillips, if you would like to come up here, I'd love for you to just take a minute and talk a little bit about your law firm, and then a little bit about yourself, and then the most important thing is your why. Why did you decide to sponsor?
I see a lot of familiar faces here, so a lot of folks. And Greg Phillips, I'm actually a native Houstonian. I was just telling my story, long story, but tried to leave Houston, but couldn't get away and came back. And someone said, "Why'd you stay?" And I said, "Well, I married a girl who grew up around the corner from me, and she's not leaving Houston, so here I am." But Phillips Kaiser, we are a corporate transactional firm. We've been at it a while. I actually started on this journey with Rice. Al Danto was a business partner of mine, friend, client. He asked me years ago to do a segment of in his acquisitions class called the nuts and bolts of a startup. So I started doing that. And then he asked me to be a mentor in his acquisition lab. I started doing that. And out of that actually came relationships with folks coming through the program who actually were looking for companies to buy. And what we do, we are a transactional firm, and we work with smaller markets. So it was a good fit for what we do, because traditionally you have to go to firms like my good friend George Gonzalez at Haynes & Boone's. But we are a good fit for the smaller markets, and we're focused on that. I mean, that's what we're built around. I have a colleague, Janelle Vaughn, is with me as well. So it's been a good fit for us because our services fit kind of the smaller segments when people are doing smaller transactions. And it's just been a good relationship for us, and we're happy to be a part.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your sponsorship. We have several upcoming events that you do not want to miss. We've got 3 powerful thought leaderships. The first one that's coming up very quickly is November 3rd. Larry Coben, who's the CEO of NRG Energy. We've got one on January 14th, Dr. Wayne Riley, who is the president of Downstate Health Sciences. Then on February 5th, we've got Pascal DeRoche, who is the senior vice president and CFO at AT&T. And then our next faculty roundtable is March 4th. And that will be Dwayne Windsor, Professor of Management. On your badges, if you've got a QR code, that was when you registered, you turned in your LinkedIn, and so it's an easy way to network. Please utilize those. And then if you are a business student, don't miss this opportunity. You have the ability to attend these at no fee. In addition, you have the ability for 1 year after you graduate to attend these events. So don't miss out on these future opportunities. Lastly, please check your cell phones. We are going to be recording this event, so we'd like fewer disruptions if at all possible. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Alessandro Piazza. He's an associate professor of strategic management. Alessandro's research touches upon several areas at the intersection of organizational theory, entrepreneurship, economic sociology, and strategic management. His work has appeared in print or is forthcoming at outlets such as the Academy of Management Discoveries, the Academy of Management Journal, the Annual Review of Sociology, Organizational Science, and Strategic Management Journal. Alessandro teaches courses in strategic management, technology strategy, and organizational theory in the undergraduate, MBA, and PhD programs here at the Business School. He received a PhD in management from Columbia Business School, additionally, a doctorate in business administration, an MBA, as well as bachelor's and master's, both in nuclear engineering.
All right.
So, please join me in welcoming Professor Piazza.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. My name is Alessandro Piazza, as noted. I have been here on the faculty at Rice for 7 years and counting now. And I teach courses that deal with technology, but also with how companies can sometimes navigate socio-political environments that can be challenging, right? And so today, we are talking about something that may sound reckless on the surface, but actually turns out to be strategic. And that is how some companies break rules and then end up writing the new ones, right? And so here's the thesis I'm going to argue in the next 30 minutes or so, right? The boldest rule breakers don't fight regulators, they recruit them, right? Which, if you're a startup trying to pitch venture capital, may sound deeply unsexy, but if you want to still be in business 5 years from now, that very often is the only strategy that works, right? So let me start by hearing from you, right? And if you like, pull out your phone, or don't, just watch, and tell me one word you associate with companies that break the rules.
Felony.
Enter it in there, and then we'll see. Tell me what comes to mind, one word.
It's taking a while for my Wi-Fi to connect.
I'm gonna wait for this to populate a little bit so that I don't influence you too much, and then we'll see what you guys think.
Is there a Wi-Fi network in here? I'm not getting any signal, so I can't.
Oh, that's fine. So there's like Rice Owls,
Okay.
or Rice Owls Public, but it's, if you can't, it's fine. This is just for entertainment value. So there's a few things here, right? A lot of people, right, are telling us that this is innovative. Even more people now are telling us that, but also risky, right? So there's a sense in which breaking rules can make us bold, it can make us disruptive, right? But doing that can also lead us to be seen as reckless or dangerous or unethical even, right? And so that split that you see there in the word cloud, that's basically the essence of the whole talk. So let me just set some ground rules first and foremost. We are not here talking about behaviors like fraud, right? Because that is clearly and unambiguously crime, right? We are talking about, in essence, gray zones, right? Second, the question here will not be whether you should push boundaries. The question is going to be how to push them without getting crushed. So whatever word you chose, keep it in mind. That tension there, that's our puzzle, right? So why do some boundary pushers become standard setters over time, whereas others get shut down? Let me try and show you with a story, right? Imagine we are in 2012 San Francisco. Uber launches something called UberX, right? And before that time, you may not remember this, but Uber actually used to employ black car drivers directly at the very beginning. But now, with UberX, anyone can drive for Uber, right? If you have an Honda Accord and a clean record, then you too can be an Uber driver. At the time in San Francisco, a taxi medallion would cost $250,000. All of that for a taxi license. And now you no longer need one, right? No permit needed to become an Uber driver. You simply download the app, you pass a background check, and then you start driving. And then within weeks, there are hundreds of drivers on the streets. Within a month or so, there are thousands. And of course, at that point, taxis are furious, right? So the Municipal Transportation Agency in San Francisco is furious too. And so the California Public Utilities Commission sends Uber a cease and desist letter, right? Essentially saying you are operating an unlicensed taxi service, you must stop immediately. And what is Uber's response to this? Basically no, right? They simply keep operating. And in fact, they don't simply keep operating, they expand. More cities, more drivers, they basically flood the zone. New York, and then LA, and then Chicago, same playbook, right? You launch first, you deal with the law later, right? A classic example of the move fast and break things ethos in Silicon Valley, right? In some cities, they even go as far as to offer $500 bonuses to new drivers right before the city is about to vote on a cap or a ban for Uber, right? Now, from the outside, this kind of looked insane, right? Even in hindsight, you're basically violating laws in dozens of cities at the same time. You have taxi companies suing, you have regulators threatening you, you have city councils that are holding emergency hearings, and it seems like a fight that Uber cannot possibly win, right? But here is where it gets interesting, right? Because in 2013, Uber pivots. And what they realize is we cannot possibly win this fight city by city and lawsuit by lawsuit just by being defiant, right? And so they do something that doesn't quite make headlines, right? But which turns out to be decisive in the long run, right? And what they do is they hire lobbyists, dozens of lobbyists in every state capital around the country. And then they begin sharing data with cities. They share stuff like trip patterns, like where people go, when, which neighborhoods are currently ignored by taxis. And then they draft legislation, model bills, that states can now simply copy and paste. And these bills collectively create a new category called Transportation Network Company, right? Or TNC. Not a taxi, not a limo service, something new. And here are the insurance requirements you should be imposing, and here are the background check standards. What is the result of all this? That by 2016, just 4 years after that cease and desist letter, a majority of US states had passed some version of Uber's draft legislation. And lo and behold, Uber is legal. Not because they won in court, right? Not because regulators gave up, but because they rewrote the rules, right? They created a new category, the TNC, that didn't exist before. They got states to adopt it, and they also turned their riders into a political constituency, right? That elected officials could not ignore. They would send riders a message on the app essentially saying, hey, your city is about to vote on an Uber ban, right? Here's the email address for your city councilor. Stuff like that. Today, Uber is a $120 billion company, right? And taxis still exist, they are still there, but the regulatory landscape has, by now, permanently changed. Hold that picture though, because that is not simply Uber's story, right? Let me return to that riddle that I posed at the beginning, right? Why do some boundary pushers become standard setters, whereas others get shut down? Now, those of you of my generation who are close in age to me might remember Napster. Napster was the first software built for sharing music online, okay? All the way back in 1999. 80 million users at the time, built entirely on copyrighted music. It was dead by 2001, unsurprisingly, right? And then take Spotify, right? Which many of us also know well, right? It's a very similar idea in many ways, but crucially they licensed the content, right? And this is a $50 billion company now. So what's the difference? There are at least a few, and so let's try and make sense. I would say it's not necessarily the innovation quality, right? Great ideas get killed all the time. Mediocre ones often survive. I would actually argue Napster was a great idea when that came out, right? The missing variable, though, was when you break the rules, you often don't have a sense of how it's going to play out, meaning how control unfolds and how you end up responding to it, right? Let me use two more quick stories to make my point here, right? I assume we are all familiar with Airbnb, right? This started in 2008 when the founders of Airbnb started renting out air mattresses in their San Francisco apartment to conference attendees, which certainly makes for a very cute origin story, right? But by 2011, it's not just air mattresses anymore, right? It's entire apartments that are rented short-term to tourists, often in cities where doing that is illegal, right? New York, for example, has a law that says you cannot rent out your apartment for less than 30 days unless you are present, right? But Airbnb facilitates exactly that, and so hosts start getting fines of the order of $7,500. Buildings start evicting tenants, right? And then housing advocates say, well, you are turning apartments into hotels, you are driving up rents, you are displacing long-term residents. And they certainly have a point in saying this, right? And so by 2013, New York is now threatening to shut Airbnb down, and then Airbnb sues the city. They're in court, they're in the danger zone, But here too, in 2014, 2015, something changes and Airbnb pivots. They start proposing their own limits, right? A maximum of 90 nights in London, 120 days in Paris. They start sharing data with local municipalities, like how many nights hosts are renting their places, how many are full-time versus occasional hosts, how many rent rooms in their primary home versus entirely unoccupied or empty apartments, right? And similarly to what Airbnb had done, they also draft ordinances, registration, taxes, night caps, and crucially, as a gesture of goodwill, Airbnb offers to collect hotel taxes, right? And by 2018, it does so in 500 plus jurisdictions, bringing in over $2 billion annually for local governments, right? You know how this ends, right? By 2020 and still in 2025, Airbnb is legal in most major cities, albeit with regulations, and not everywhere, right? So New York City, Paris, Barcelona, and other places still restrict Airbnbs heavily. Why do we see these ongoing fights? Because in some sense, the underlying harm here is real, right? Housing supply in tight markets can genuinely shrink, and so here cooperation can help you, but it can only get you a partial win. So in some sense, this kind of strategy can help you survive, but doesn't, of course, eliminate trade-offs. And then there's 23andMe, right, which many of you guys may also have heard of. This was founded in 2006 to basically provide direct-to-consumer genetic testing, with the idea being you spit in a tube and you get ancestry and health reports back, right? And so by 2013, 23andMe is telling customers stuff like, look, you're a carrier for cystic fibrosis, right? Or you have a higher risk for Alzheimer's. And of course, the FDA hears of this, and what do they say? They say, stop immediately, because you are actually marketing an unapproved medical device, right? And very often, right, this is the end of the road for many biotech companies. In 2013, the company gets an FDA letter that's public, it's scathing, and it's basically a formal shutdown, right? Most companies, frankly, die here, right? You cannot fight the FDA and win, right? It typically doesn't happen. But 23andMe doesn't really fight. Instead, what they say is we are pausing our efforts while we work with the FDA. And so they partner with the regulator, right? They run clinical validation studies. They try and prove accuracy. They work on offering clear labeling. And then they propose direct-to-consumer genetic testing standards, right? Eventually, 4 years pass, and in 2017, the FDA authorizes 23andMe for the first time to offer reports on 10 specific conditions, right? And it's the first direct-to-consumer genetic test ever approved in the US. And so now, the company is able to sell health and ancestry reports legally, and they created, via their struggle, a regulatory pathway, right, that other companies can now follow, right? Because getting authorized by the FDA is precedent. Now, full disclosure, they also filed for bankruptcy in 2024. They had a data breach and issues with profitability, and so I would say while their FDA strategy worked, their business model sadly didn't. Enough of the stories now, so let me now try and zoom out and show you the pattern, right? So let's draw this. Imagine that you're doing something new, and that something new is in a legal gray area. I don't know, imagine that you're running a startup that delivers tacos with drones, right? You have flying robots that are dropping Mexican food on people's lawns, right? So you launched yesterday, right? And today people have opinions. And many of them are not good, right? So the first question is, very simply, who is mad at you and how are they showing it, right? Down here at the bottom, right, in the informal side of things, it's maybe people on Reddit or X, it's local news, it's maybe petitions. And this is informal pressure, which can be loud sometimes, but doesn't really carry the force of law. But up here at the top, at the formal end of things, you have maybe the FAA or a federal judge or a city council passing an emergency ordinance to stop you, right? So this is formal control, and it does have the force of law, right? And so this vertical line here is fundamentally about how control shows up, right? At the bottom, informal, angry tweets, boycotts, bad press. At the top, formal, lawsuits, regulations, legislation, right? So taco drones, people mad at you on the internet, down here. If you're getting a cease and desist from the FAA, up there. If that makes sense, that is axis number one, right? And the second question then is, how are you responding to this, right? So on the left side, you basically have the try and stop me strategy, right? So you ignore the cease and desist, you keep flying, you countersue, maybe have a good old confrontation, right? On the right side, you have the let's figure this out together strategy, right? So you call the FAA and you say, hey, we'd like to run a small pilot with you, right? Small area, limited hours, we'll even share flight data with you, right? Would that make you comfortable? This is basically cooperation, right? And now we have 4 boxes. The bottom left, right, is what I would call the brawl, right? You have public outcry, social media backlash, and stakeholder confrontation. At the top left, you have what I call the cliff. You're in court with lawsuits, you have regulatory battles, you have fights playing out over legislation. At the bottom right, you have what I call the pilot zone. You are running this informal stakeholder engagement efforts, running pilots, and trying to build support. At the top right, you have what I call the authors table, right? And that's co-creating regulations and even legislation with the government, okay? Ultimately, that's where you want to be, right? Because that's where you have permission that sticks. So now let's try and map out our stories, right? Uber started bottom left. People were mad at them in San Francisco, especially taxi drivers, brawl. Then top left, cease and desist from the city, cliff. And then it moved bottom right, right? Started sharing data, lobbying, pilot zone. And then, in the end, got states to pass TNC laws, right? Airbnb, similar thing, started bottom left, cities mad, hosts getting fined, they were sued by the city, and so they ended up here, but then they offered to collect taxes, share data, negotiated over time, they helped writing law, and they ended here, right? 23andMe arguably started with the FDA shutting them down, so they were already here, Over time, though, they were able to garner approval from the FDA, and they helped writing the rules, right? So, in some sense, 3 different paths, but the same destination. And how you actually get there is the playbook that we are going to cover next. So, let's try and test this framework, right? And here I'm gonna call you guys to participate for the second time. Say that you're the general manager for an e-scooter company, right? And you now want to launch in Houston, since we currently don't have e-scooters, mostly, right? So what do? And the options are, you ask the city for permission first, you try launching a pilot in one neighborhood, you try and launch citywide and then deal with the blowback later, or don't launch because it's too risky and you would rather focus on a market that is less uncertain. So, let's see what y'all think. Oh. I'm going to reveal it in just a moment. So it seems, okay. There is, we clearly have an audience of rule breakers here, don't we? Holy moly. Okay, so nobody wants to ask for permission first. I am so proud of you all. Nobody wants to just give up. There's some folks that want to try and sort of go hardcore, move fast and break things style, but an overwhelming majority is in favor of launching this via a pilot, which I think is fair, but for the sake of comprehensiveness, let me walk you through all 4. So the first option is arguably the safest and the slowest. If you do this, you might as well show up with a draft permit so that you can try and shape the conversation early, right? Option B, pilot with guardrails, would also have been my pick, right? You start small, you build trust, and only after you formalize and you scale. C is in many ways the riskiest option. It's fast, it's often expensive. It only works if you have deep pockets and if you have a reasonable expectation that you will not be shut down right away. More on this later. Option D, sometimes this is the right option. Patience is a virtue. Sometimes figuring out the right timing for something is just as important as figuring out what to do. Okay? So, let me give you 5 moves, a playbook of sorts, on how to make this kind of decisions, right? Move 1, pilot with a clock and a third party. The principle here is this. You want to ask for a time box pilot that has both clear metrics and an independent evaluator. Why does this work? 3 reasons. First, you want to give them something like a sunset clause, right? Something like, we'll operate for 6 months and then we will stop automatically unless you extend us, and this lowers the risk for the regulator, right? Second, you want to have a third party, right? You will say, we'll hire an independent safety auditor, you pick them, we pay them, and now the regulator doesn't have to trust you. Third, you want to make this small in scope, right? 1 neighborhood, limited hours, 50 or so units, right? This is what Waymo right, the self-driving car company, did in San Francisco at the very beginning. They said, we'll operate only 50 autonomous vehicles in this 10-block area for 6 months with a third-party safety monitor, and if we hit more than X incidents, we'll stop automatically, right? The city is then likely to say yes because the ask is small and it's also reversible. Pilots can often be slow and frustrating, but they're only meant to be the unlock, right? Once you're operating, even in a tiny zone, then you have data, and data beats promises every time, and then you can scale. Move to, try and bring receipts and not promises, right? You want to instrument everything that matters. You want to publish data before regulators even ask for it, right? And this works because regulators cannot defend your press release to an angry city council, but they can defend your data if it's real and verified, right? Things like safety. You don't simply say, we are committed to safety. That means nothing, right? You want to show them crash logs, incident rates, response protocols, right? Fairness. You want to show them who gets service, who doesn't, by neighborhood and by time of day. Crucially, as of late, provenance. Where did you get your inputs? Can you prove you have the right to use them? A debate that is now very topical given the debate surrounding AI training, okay? I already mentioned here how Uber started sharing trip data with cities, pick up and drop off patterns, and cities then use this data to argue, look, taxis are not serving the airport at 2 a.m., but Uber is, and so we need it, right? Uber is no longer the villain, they are now filling a service gap, okay? Third, you want to borrow legitimacy and build the right coalition, right? Very often you don't want to go at this alone. You want to create a coalition of, for example, insurers, depending on your industry, first responders and patient advocates, academics, essentially validators that can lower the political cost of saying yes, right? Because the regulator is fundamentally asking themselves, if I approve this, who is going to yell at me, right? And so your job, in some sense, is to give them cover, right? If an insurance company is willing to cover you, show that. That is a credibility signal, right? If the fire chief says, we have trained with them, the city council can hide behind that, right? If you are supported by, say, disability groups or consumer safety organizations, that is huge too, right? Academics can help too in the form of, say, independent labs who have validated your claims, right? 23andMe did this quite well at the beginning, partnering with Stanford, but it also got independent validation from genetic counseling organizations, okay? Number 4, and I mentioned this before too, you want to be the one offering the model rule, right? Draft the permit, the legislation, the piece of regulation yourself. Make sure to include things like scope, limits, safety standards, review dates, reporting cadence, right? And this typically matters because regulators, like most government actors, are often both overworked and under-resourced, right? And so if you hand them a blank page, they will either do nothing for 2 years or end up writing something so restrictive that you can't operate, right? But if you hand them a draft they can defend, they will very often take it. This is what Uber did with the TNC legislation, right? Gave it to state legislators in all 50 states, and most states, about 4 in 5, passed some version of those. Why? Because writing law from scratch is hard, time-consuming, whereas editing a draft is easy, or easier, right? And that is where you become a lobbyist, right? Many of us in companies, they want to go and build or do cool stuff, right? Not write laws. But sometimes, if you don't do it, then your more established competitor will, right? And so you can either complain about bureaucracy or you can architect it. That is your call. Finally, and crucially, price the downside, meaning know your pause plan, right? What if something goes wrong? You wanna pre-commit to pause criteria, right? This preserves trust. Being subjected to a forced shutdown destroys it, right? You want to include things like trigger conditions, like what would make you stop, who has the power to hit the pause button, do you tell regulators before you tell the press, and what has to happen before you resume. This is what happened with self-driving company Cruise when they had a serious incident where they dragged a pedestrian, right? They didn't wait for California DMV to shut them down. They pulled the entire fleet themselves, investigated, published findings, implemented fixes, and so on and so forth, right? If you fight every shutdown, eventually you risk losing your license permanently, okay? And so this is really a sequence, right? So first you want to start with a pilot to get operating, even if it's a small pilot. Second, receipts, right? You want to generate data from that pilot. Third, legitimacy. Bring validators who can vouch for the data and for your credibility. Fourth, rule, right? Use the data and the validators as springboards to draft the formal rule. And then if needed, pause, meaning build trust by showing you will stop if things go wrong, right? That is the path that takes you from rule breaking to the pilot zone and all the way up to the top right of the chart, okay? Now, some guardrails or caveats, right? When might this not work, right? We have seen cases in which it worked well, but I also want to caution you about 3 tripwires, right? One involves the severity of harm, right? So if even potential harm is severe, you want to make sure you run audits before you launch, right? Case in point, Boeing self-certified the 737 MAX, and then 300 plus people died, right? And the company, for a time, seemed almost on the verge of collapse. But, on the other hand, autonomous vehicles now run millions of test miles first, because of course the risk of harming a pedestrian is high, and so when harm is high, you want to go slow. Second, you want to have some degree of consensus, right? So generally, if half the room wants you banned, any settlement you reach, any agreement you reach, is fragile, right? Airbnb is still fighting in New York City, in Paris, in Barcelona, because in many places, housing advocates actually have a point, right? And so when consensus is split, very often you have to address the harm proactively, not just negotiate around it. The third caveat is obviously about the provenance of inputs, right? If you can't defend what you're doing, you probably should not ship it, right? Napster built an entire business model on essentially stolen music, and that worked for a while, but it wasn't defensible, right? AI companies now are training their models on scraped data, and I don't know if you followed the news, but Anthropic was already made to pay $1 billion plus fine to authors whose content they used to train their models, right? So here, you know, to me, the lesson is, if your foundation is tainted, right? Pirated content, stolen data, IP you don't own, this playbook will likely not save you in the long run, okay? So, going back to that word cloud we saw at the start, right? Some people said that this was, rule breaking was innovative, bold, disruptive. Other folks saw it as reckless or dangerous, unethical even, right? And so my goal here was not to convince you that rule breaking is always good. It's not, right? The goal was to show you strategically what can separate the two, right? Typically, those companies that were able to turn reckless into innovative were companies that did three things, right? They moved right on the framework from confrontation to cooperation. They moved up from informal agreements like pilots to formal rules. They brought receipts, data, validators, draft rules, and pause plans, right? In some sense, then, the boldest rebels out there won out in the end by being the best bureaucrats, right? And so, to me, bureaucracy is not red tape, right? It's also permanence, right? Permanence is what keeps you in the game, right? Keeps you viable within that set of rules that you have now helped establish, right? So that playbook, right, of the 5 moves that I covered is what takes you from, I guess, a gray zone to a green light, right? And this is not exciting work, right? Nobody will ever write, you know, breathless headlines about regulatory compliance. Never happens. But that is what got Uber from the cease and desist at the beginning to writing TNC laws, right? And 23andMe from FDA shutdown to FDA approval. The list goes on, right? One last thought. This framework can be used in 2 ways, right? One is to genuinely solve the problem, and that is, you know, build safely, share the upside, and help write rules that you can be proud of, right? But you can also use this to try and launder legitimacy, where you simply perform cooperation while at the same time you are hiding harm, right? I cannot stop you from doing the second one, but I can tell you it doesn't work for long because regulators are not stupid, journalists catch on, and when they do, you do not just lose the fight, you also poison the well for everybody else who may come after you. So to summarize, defy end design, right? Break the rule and build the next one, move quickly and bring receipts. Because ultimately the goal is, again, to write rules that you can be proud of. So thank you for engaging with me and for engaging with the gray zone with seriousness. I will take any questions you might have.
Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. Nice job, very entertaining, very insightful. Okay, open it up for questions. We have about 10 minutes.
Thank you for the talk. So between Napster and Spotify, there were a few others. I don't know if people remember. There was Last.fm and Pandora.
LimeWire.
LimeWire was probably in the Napster field, but I'm moving it more towards the Spotify. So
Yeah.
what probably went wrong with Last.fm? Because I think they had a big chance.
I was a power user of that, by the way.
I think we all were. If you use Spotify, you probably use Last.fm.
Certain age group. So I don't think there's a clear solution or answer there, right? So very often what happens is, and you see this across types of platforms, right? The first platform often ends up not being the one that dominates, right? Just like, the iPhone was not the first smartphone. Facebook was actually not the first social network, right? So we used to be on MySpace too. I don't know if you remember this. But my sense is Spotify winning out is probably explained the best by relationships they had built over time with essentially the music industry giants, right? And those were connections that I think Last.fm really didn't have, because obviously if you're bootstrapping a platform like that from the ground up, what you want to make sure of is you want to ensure that the user base has access to a whole lot of content from the get-go, right? Otherwise, they're simply not going to join. And I think Spotify was able to pull that off for that reason, and Last.fm wasn't because of, I think, the lack of that. But speculation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could you give maybe some B2B examples? Move 3, the vetted innovation, building the right coalition, kind of some thoughts around B2B examples of this?
So I don't necessarily think that things are all that different in the B2B space, right? So I cannot think of any examples off the top of my head, really, but I think the only difference is that this kind of examples are better known and get covered more, right? But I actually would say pretty much the same rules apply in the B2B setting, right? You're still gonna have regulators, right? You may still attract unwanted attention from, citizens or the press or independent journalists, right? And so I think by and large, the playbook's the same. It just doesn't get a whole lot of traction in the media, right? And so the examples are often a little bit less memorable.
I guess one question I have is around when you're dealing with regulators, at the end of the day, you're creating an even playing field.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do you balance the process and the time required in the process you've outlined versus the critical need to gain critical mass as fast as you can? In particular with the software companies where the barriers of entry are very low. I mean, 23andMe, you have to have all the equipment to actually do the DNA testing, where software and unique commercial model is pretty repeatable. So you have to build a brand fast during that time. So how do you balance sort of the needs of both of those, having the regulation, but also you sort of have to be breaking the rules to get the critical mass in the first place?
I think, ideally organizations would be ambidextrous, right, and sort of walk and chew gum and do both at the same time. I think in reality what most often happens is this actually happen in different time periods, right? So in some sense, the mantra that you should, move fast and break things is basically an invitation to try and build and gain traction and even start scaling, right? Before the regulator even notices you, right? And so historically what most companies have done is precisely that, right? So there is a shift to what I might call non-market strategy and lobbying and trying to sort of embrace or capture the regulator, but that typically happens a little bit later in the game. It is, however, something that if you're thinking about established companies, right, not upstart companies, in that case, companies will very much do both at all times, right? Because if you're an incumbent, then it's imperative for you to be at the table, right, where the regulations get written at all times. In some sense, the fact that taxis lost out is, at least in part, a function of those taxi drivers were actually not at the rule-making table, right? Whereas Uber and Lyft were.
I wonder if you might comment on or predict on the large language models' abuse of copyright data for training, which is happening everywhere.
Yeah.
And that's still to be determined how that's going to work out. And then secondly, I like your idea of appeals to the bureaucracy and setting out models that solve the issue for you relative to the industry. But I wonder about appeals to the executive directly. And crypto comes to mind on that.
Yes. So let me try and split that. So I think for AI, we very much have what I call a provenance problem, right? Meaning right now, most AI companies are, they're currently trying to sweep this under the rug, but they're all essentially running on pirated content, right? And so I think what's gonna happen is courts, but also society at large, are gonna have to sort of reckon and balance the value that AI brings to the table in terms of productivity improvements or what have you, with the severity of the harm done, right? And so what is already happening now is you are starting to see this like sort of big settlements where Anthropic and very likely at some point OpenAI are forced or will be forced to pay money to settle these. And going forward, they might do stuff differently, like for example, training models on user input, right? But I think this is not going to be the kind of scenario where the AI companies are going to be stamped out of existence because they did this. At this point, they have grown too big and too important to just be swept out, right? Appealing to the executive directly is, I would say, a more contemporary strategy where historically it didn't work. Now we are seeing instances of it working. A word of caution there would be legislation is somewhat stable, right? So once you pass legislation, is relatively hard to change, particularly federal law and particularly in a gridlock Congress, right? The executive is less stable because it has an expiration date of 4 years at the most. So that would be my word of caution there, and I'll say no more.
All right, awesome. I think we are out of time. Another round of applause. Awesome. Thank you so much. We have a little present for you from Rice Business Partners. As I mentioned, if you are interested in joining as a member or as a sponsor, we would love to chat with you. We also would love to get your feedback on the survey. I believe it's on your table. There's a QR code. Let me see. Does it also come up on here?
Hold on.
No worries. I think you'll get an email too. Let's see. There we go. If we could get your feedback, that would be awesome. And thank you again. And drive safe.
You guys